All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to KPC Podcast. I'm Hannah Thurman.
And I'm Karsan Turner.
And today we're going to be talking about President Trump's proposed new legislation on DACA. We will also be talking about the World Economic Forum that Trump spoke at, and Karsan will have some things to speak on as well. Karsan?
Yes, a couple things we're going to be talking about is the state of free speech on college campuses, specifically with cultural icon Ben Shapiro, and then good news, Sam Brownback is leaving Kansas, but bad news, he's going to be working for the Trump administration. So, Hannah, go ahead and start off with what you were going to talk about.
All right. So on Thursday, President Trump proposed new legislation that would lead as many as 1.8 million young undocumented immigrants to citizenship. This plan was drafted by Stephen Miller, the president's domestic policy advisor, and John F. Kelly, the White House chief of staff. The New York Times reported that this legislation asks for the exchange for Congress to create a $25 billion trust fund to pay for the border wall, increase immigration arrests, speed up deportation, crack down on people who overstay their visas, prevent citizens from bringing their parents to the U.S., and end a State Department program designed to encourage migration from underrepresented countries. The Times reported that White House officials described his plan as extremely generous and that the legislation would pave the way to citizenship not only for 690,000 people who had signed up for protection under DACA, but also for an additional 1.1 million undocumented immigrants who would have qualified for the program but never applied. The Times also reported that this bill was immediately rejected by the Democrats, immigration advocates, and some Republicans. Some described it as an attempt to close the nation's borders, which is something that the president has repeatedly commented on by implementing a border wall. Fox News quoted President Trump saying, "We're not looking at citizenship, we're not looking at amnesty, we're looking at allowing people to stay here." Trump also said, "We're going to morph into it, it's going to happen at some point in the future, over a period of 10 to 12 years. If no deal is reached on this, DACA recipients will face deportation when the program fully expires on March 5th. So I found this interesting from the quotes from Fox because Trump is saying it's going to happen over a period of 10 to 12 years, which he doesn't have 10 to 12 years, even if he got elected. Again, right. That's 8. And his quote, "We're not looking at citizenship, we're not looking at amnesty, we're looking at allowing people to stay here." That's basically citizenship.
So DACA is just the status quo.
Basically.
As in passing a law that says law, and then it's just empty.
I don't know. I do not know what's going to happen with this one. I know that there's still bipartisan groups around that want to create something that both sides want to work with. I think immigration is one of those stances that I think everyone believes that there's always going to be butting heads, but with this, I think that there can be a deal reached that both sides agree with. At the end of the day, I think that this one is interesting. At first, when I read it, I said, I can get behind that. I kind of like it. And then I read in exchange for with this long list, and I completely agree that it sounds like he wants to close borders. I mean, if that's not clear with the border wall, I don't know what is.
I think maybe what some of these DACA new regulations that Trump is putting in could be a sign of the Trump administration saying, okay, Democrats, I'm here, I'll still work with you on this deal, even though from the government shutdown it seemed that they've done this 3 times and they still haven't budged. So maybe, hopefully whenever they look at this, they'll at least be in with negotiating, and then they can actually work something out that is more bipartisan.
I agree.
Yeah, I accidentally said so I'm not going to add to that.
All right, what do you got for us today?
Some water that I'm going to drink real quick.
Good. Hydration is key.
Okay, so as I teased in the intro about college campuses, are they truly as open-minded as they claim to be? I would argue, at least in this current state, not necessarily. I think we know as college students that every professor sits on the left wing. I've never seen one professor that has done otherwise. But does this actually end up harming students? It actually does. So on January 24th, this was 2 days ago, University of Connecticut put limitations on seating for conservative speaker Ben Shapiro. For some context for Ben Shapiro, he's been called numerous things. He's been called a racist, even though his wife is Moroccan. He's been called a neo-Nazi, even though he's an Orthodox Jew. He is also referred to as a fascist, even though one of the rules he has whenever he gives a presentation is that he tells anyone who disagrees with him to come up to the front of the line so they get to talk first. So he makes it easier for dissenting viewpoints instead of telling them to get out. And I mean, you would think that if the University of Connecticut, which by the way also offered counseling to students, not who were watching the event, but were just they just couldn't handle his presence, they could have free counseling. You would think that he'd be giving some pretty violent advocating speeches, but absolutely not. I actually watched his full speech this morning, and there was not one thing in it that was terrifying in any way. And this actually ended up happening last September in Berkeley. Ben Shapiro went to speak, but groups like Antifa were so against him speaking that Ben personally paid an extra $600,000 to ensure that the police would be able to protect the school from any damages. Let's see. And of course, ironically enough, the topic of his speech was campus thuggery, which is exactly what he was fighting. And what are some other... So a couple of other things about the... give me 1 second to look for that real quick. But the Berkeley speech is that, they limited how many people could sit in the auditorium. They completely weren't allowing seating up in the balcony because they were afraid that protesters would rip chairs from the top of the balcony and throw them down onto students. And I think this has a lot to say for the free speech movement, especially when it comes to college campuses and anything like that. Do you have any comments before I keep going? Or you look?
I have I pulled up an article from Fox News on this because I wanted to see what their take was on that, and I have an email to the students from the university.
Okay, yeah, do you want to read that?
Yeah, so in the email it says, "We understand that even the thought of an individual coming to campus with the views that Mr. Shapiro expresses can be concerning and even hurtful, and that's why we wanted to make you aware as soon as we were informed. In the meantime, please utilize the many campus resources available to you should you want to talk through your feelings about this issue, including my office, the cultural centers, the Dean of Students Office, and CMHS if necessary." And Shapiro apparently told students that something needs to be done about the system where a few, quote, where a few crazed leftists overreact to an event and therefore local residents cannot even attend.
Yeah, and I mean, stuff like this happens all the time for him. He was invited to go speak at, I think it was a college in Texas, and they told him that he was not allowed to speak, and if he set foot on the campus, he'd be arrested. It was a private college, so they were allowed to do that, and so he just took everyone who was invited. They just went somewhere else, and he was able to give his speech, but seeing a lot of things like this, especially for right-winged speakers, this happens all the time. I mean, there's a speaker, his name is Milo Yiannopoulos, and even Ben even though him and Milo have this really big feud, they hate each other, but he still says that Milo should be allowed to speak in any campus he wants because that's free speech. But there have been many cases where Milo was going to speak at a campus and the university would throw on an extra $10,000 last minute, and if they didn't pay it right that moment, then he wasn't allowed. So he's been canceled from numerous events, and not once has he incited violence in any form of way. It's an ongoing thing, and it's even more concerning for places like Berkeley, which is considered the home of free speech. And they're not even allowing a dissenting viewpoint to give a speech to the fullest capacity in which he wanted to. The tickets sold out within 5 minutes because there were so little seats. And I think the more people give that form of exposure to Ben, the more they start to realize, like, oh, he's not that bad. In fact, a couple things is, like, a lot of people whom he vastly disagrees with, he's really good friends with. I actually have this whole list here. So, for example, Slate.com, who I always make fun of for writing terrible pieces, wrote this really long cover story on Ben Shapiro. And of course, it's biased, but it gave Ben a very fair hearing, which is something he definitely deserves. Let's see, there was a headline from Forward.com. I thought this was funny. "Why do I suddenly like Ben Shapiro, even though I hate his policies?" New York Times has also defended Ben Shapiro. He's close friends with Dave Rubin, a liberal talk show host for the Rubin Report. Despite Shapiro's views on gay marriage, him and Dave are able to be good friends, even though Dave is married to a man. Same thing with, he has some controversial views on like gender pronouns, even though he recently befriended trans YouTuber Blair White during a debate that they had. They ended up becoming friends. And he was also featured on Joe Rogan's podcast, getting a lot of exposure, and that's the second most viewed podcast that Joe Rogan's ever done. And so, yeah, I think it's good that he's getting a lot of exposure. People are actually hearing him out. A lot of people are able to, he does this thing where he separates what he thinks versus what's actually happening, and he's not afraid to condemn both sides. In fact, a lot of people on the right hate him because he left Breitbart, because during the campaign, they were so pro-Trump. He wasn't a big fan of Trump, and they absolutely hated him. So, yeah, and it's weird that people vilify. I mean, even if you just like look at this, it's like, oh shoot, America's most wanted guy. Yeah. But it's like, he's actually like a 5'9", scrawny little dude.
But. Fox also has a quote from a student that said this to Shapiro: "Free speech is more important than people's feelings." And I, as a journalism major, I'm sure you do too, agree that free speech is very important.
Absolutely.
I think when it comes to things like Westboro Baptist Church, that's where I have a problem, because I think that's hate speech, and that is so pointed at specific people. Granted, that's still their opinions, that's still there.
Yeah, they have every right to...
So I think this is very interesting. I think that Connecticut took some very interesting steps, or UConn took some very interesting steps in this, and I don't necessarily agree with them. I think that if someone like that came to KU, I would consider going just to see what they have to say. I probably won't agree with it, but it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and well, even you say, like, Westboro Baptist Church, who a lot of people disagree with them. I disagree with them too, but if they came to KU, I would definitely want to go there. I want to see what they have to say. And if I do enough of my research and, based on how dumb their thought process is, being able to debunk them, that's much more satisfying than just completely erasing them from even coming in the first place.
Right.
And I think this is a pattern that I've seen a lot I've heard a lot of different stories from a lot of different campuses. There's this girl, her name's Lindsay Shepherd at the University of Toronto. She is an English TA who got in a lot of trouble because she was talking about like pronouns and showed a debate between two people who were pro-pronoun, or one guy was pro, one guy was against it, and she just showed a clip of it. Got called into the board of directors for the humanities, where they were like yelling at her, and she recorded it too, and like she was crying at one point because they just kept calling her like a transphobe, even though she was doing nothing transphobic. And a lot of things like this have just been on the rise as campuses become more and more, it's almost like they're inclusive of a certain viewpoint. At KU, I noticed the left leaning, but I don't think it's been taken to any extremes, which is good, but I only hope that from this point on, we start seeing much more of a balance, as opposed to, I hope KU doesn't go too far left before we have to start bringing a balance.
Yeah, you cannot run from other opinions, other sides, especially with politics. I just think it's ridiculous. You can't run from it, because you have to be educated and you have to listen. And I think UConn's running away from an opinion they don't like and they don't want to hear.
They missed out on a big opportunity to get a lot of extra money too, because according to, I think it was an article from Fox, there were 500 to 600 people waiting outside just to be able to say hi to Ben as he walked by, even though they couldn't go in. So yeah, I thought that was interesting, especially on just where free speech lies as a whole. But yeah, you've got a couple other stories?
Right. I have a little bit on Trump speaking in Switzerland at the World Economic Forum. Here he pushed his America First rhetoric, which we hear so often. He's quoted by the New York Times that Trump had said, "America First is not America alone," which I thought was an interesting quote, because
America First is not...
It's not America alone.
What does that mean?
That's what I asked, and then I was thinking about it, and it makes a little sense. He's still saying, I'm willing to work with other countries. We'll listen to you guys. We'll listen to your opinions, but at the end of the day, we're putting America first. And that's what I got from it. CNN also reported that Trump insisted that his America First governing agenda would not prevent him from negotiating bilateral trade agreements as long as they favor American interests. So that kind of goes off of that. At one point in his speech, though, Trump had said that it wasn't until I became a politician that I realized how nasty, how mean, how vicious, and how fake the press can be. To that, the crowd booed in response to that, and Trump had said that as a businessman, he was just fine with the press and that the press was nicer to him then. And I think many were expecting Trump to speak on the Mueller investigation, but that also did not happen. Mm-hmm. But the main bit that I got from that was his comment on the press.
Mm-hmm. I think I have to agree with what he says. I mean, obviously, when you're in such a high power as the President of the United States, you're going to have a lot of press on you. I think, especially since, you know, a lot of the news we see, it's almost like, it's kind of like a trend to dislike Donald Trump. A lot of people, there are people who look into Trump's policies and then don't like him, and then there are people who don't look into Trump's policies and they don't like him. And then, you know, you see something like Stephen Colbert says something that he doesn't like Trump, but then every late night host, this is kind of a side complaint, but late night talk shows are so bad because every person is the same. It's like they all have the same view. They all make fun of Trump. That's all they really do. And I feel like if there were more, you know, diversity of thought, how funny would it be to see like John Oliver making fun of Stephen Colbert or something, and then they have to debate, two comedians debating on, like, that'd be so awesome. But no, they all just they just have the same view. But and I think another thing that plays into this whole media fake news era is that we're finally relying on the internet a lot more for our news, and you see this type of argument come around every time there's a new medium. Whenever the, you know, like the first cheaper newspapers ever came out, people didn't trust them because they were so accessible. Same thing with radio, same thing with TV. And so I think, I don't know how long it's going to take for people to start trusting the news again, but we're just kind of in that cycle where everyone goes online, so anyone, it's a free reign. So it's just going to take a little bit more time before everyone can have trust in the media. But
I agree. And to me, I personally get annoyed anytime he brings up the news and how fake, nasty, whatever he wants to say about it. Just because I think that the press, he sees a headline he doesn't like, say stuff about his allegations, things like that. And I think he always refers to that as fake news. Because if you look at any other president, other than like maybe Bill Clinton, I'm sure there has been a lot of allegations against different presidents.
There's been a few confirmed ones about Clinton with Monica.
Right, but you know, we don't see this many or to this extent.
Right. And
I think that has been surrounding him, and so that's a lot of the stuff that he might consider nasty. But if you look at every other headline when it's talking about his legislation, opinions, blah, 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 that's coverage of every president that you're going to see. Every news outlet has a different opinion, whether they're biased or not. If you don't like the headline, you don't like the headline. Just don't pay attention to them.
I've heard a lot, too, that it's not even, a lot of the times it's not the authors of the stories who write the headline. It's someone else who is the headline guy, and they just read the first couple paragraphs and then just come up with a headline, which is such a terrible move for journalists. And I don't know, I think there is a huge, it's like now there's different branches of journalists. So like whenever I hear Trump say fake news, I don't ever get offended because I think to myself like, well, there is fake news out there that exists.
Right, we covered that. We talked about it.
So I just kind of also use it as a forum to ensure that I don't fall into that same trap of viewing those fake articles. And so I try to make sure that I'm just kind of on my A game whenever it comes to things like that. But I don't know, I think there's, like I said, there's two different branches of journalists. There's the ones who fake news and real news. So as long as you're making sure that you're sticking to the real news, there's not, I feel like I personally don't worry about anything because I know that I try to fact check and I don't just suck.
I agree. Yeah, no, I try to stay away from the articles, but he seems to be attacking the actual organizations. And I think the New York Times and CNN are great outlets to get my news, but I also have become increasingly impressed with Fox News, and I've been reading them quite a bit now too. And so I think that it depends. I mean, articles, may have mistakes. News outlets will make mistakes. We talked about that with the fake news awards. It happens, but I just think he's walking a fine line with that.
I think, and a couple other things to think about, and I really thought about this. There's a website, do you know what Pitchfork is? It's the music review. They review albums, and I listen, there's a new album that comes out, and I really like it. I'm like, oh, let's see what Pitchfork, 4.0 fake, this is fake. But the thing to keep in mind is, it's not Pitchfork. There's not one guy who's Mr. Pitchfork writing all these articles. It's different authors. So it's whenever CNN writes a piece of fake news or whatever, it's like, for the most part, I would say 90% of what they write is real news. But those 10% of mess ups aren't CNN saying, hey, you got to write this swayed story. It's the author that is at fault. And I think and if it's not honest, the reporter should be fired. Because it gives CNN a bad name. But I think there are a lot of factors that play into it. So when Trump does go against the whole fake news thing, I think it's easy for him to have that idea, but I think the important thing is to kind of tell people that there's a lot more to it than just the news outlet trying to fake stuff.
I agree.
So,
All right, so moving on.
This is going to be a lot shorter, but in terms of government legislation, I think Sam Brownback is resigning as the governor of Kansas. I think he's been the governor for the past 6 years. He was elected in 2013, I think.
I
so maybe
would not
last 5
know.
years. Oh yeah, you were
not here.
You were not at Kansas. But what his job is, it says that this is according to state.gov, which is a fake news organization. I don't trust it. The Office of International Religious Freedom has the mission of promoting religious freedom as a core objective of U.S. foreign policy. The office is headed by the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. We monitor religious persecution and discrimination worldwide, recommend and implement policies in respective regions or countries, and develop programs to promote religious freedom. I don't know a lot about Sam Brownback's religious policies, so I really don't have much to comment on other than the fact that it is kind of cool to say that we have someone from Kansas supporting, like, working up in the White House. But that's kind of all I have to say. Like I said, even when Brownback was governor, I just know that teachers didn't like him. He's more of a, I don't want to say bought out, but he received funding from the Koch brothers. But I mean, I just haven't looked into him enough to kind of have a full-fledged opinion on it. I think the overall position is a very good idea, protecting religious freedom, especially since our First Amendment was actually, our country was built upon that single principle. And
I think it'll be interesting to see what he does with that. If he does anything, it seems kind of like a job that's just there. There's a Lawrence Journal World covered that story, and they have a quote from him saying that Brownback said, "It has been a great honor to serve Kansas as their governor since 2011. And prior to that, as United States Senator and Congressman, I have been privileged and to serve and represent my fellow citizens for most of my adult life." So yeah, Pence broke that tie vote. It was 49-49, and Pence had to cast that final vote for him to be elected in.
Excellent. Yeah, I guess that's all I've got to say. Good luck, Sam Brownback. I hope you do well at your job, I guess.
And shout out to, as you said, Mike Pence for reminding us that he is the vice president. He's still there.
Yeah. So, do you have any other stories? Or
I do not.
All right, I guess that's going to wrap it up for today's episode.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah.